So Rachel, why don't you begin?
Okay. Well, I have to admit I'm a little nervous. I feel a bit the other here because, as Paul said this morning, well, we're all students of Desmond, and then there's you, Rachel. So you did say that.
It was a compliment.
Oh, okay. So I have to admit, my work is sort of, as mainly on the philosopher Ferdinand Ulrich. And so when I read Desmond's work, it's often with reference to Ulrich. And my interest was first piqued by Desmond's work when I realized that they both philosophers used the word gift when it came to being, right? They use very different language, not just German versus English, but to talk about being and to talk about metaphysics, and yet both land on this word gift. Specifically, I'm writing on Ulrich's understanding of matter. And so I like to tell people that my dissertation is on nothing. It's kind of true. But I think to kind of bastardize a phrase, nothing can be said in many ways. And that's what I think that philosophers like Ulrich and Desmond help us see. Though I'll just keep the rest of my short comments on Desmond's work from here. But precisely that being nothing, so to speak, isn't all that bad after all, right? In fact, in some ways that is the gift of creaturely being. And it seems to me that one of the tasks of Catholic philosophy, and we were kind of getting into this right at the end of the last session, or specifically metaphysics, Catholic metaphysics, is not just to think being, but to think created being, right? And all that implies. And I think, we're kind of scratching the surface right now on what that means. And that's also why I think this term gift is being used by many different thinkers about being. I think John Milbank has gone as far as calling it a transcendental, which is interesting. But thinking about being precisely as created does mean thinking about nothing, as it were, which I think makes us a little uncomfortable. As Desmond puts it in The Intimate Universal, God is God, and nothing but God is God, which then kind of leads us to asking the question, well then, what are we? Are we nothing? And then I think you have to answer yes and no to that question. And so this is where I find Professor Desmond's language so helpful. He helps articulate some of the many ways of saying nothing, I think. And it seems to me the entirety of his metaxology seeks to avoid or perhaps better reframe these either-or scenarios that we tend to place ourselves in, such as, is man or creation everything, or is he nothing, right? That question doesn't even really make sense when placed within a metaxological framework. And so rather, we get with Professor Desmond the language of the fertile void, which I just have found incredibly helpful for my own thinking, right? That is creation or the soul, right? Not simply as non-being, but a readiness or preparation, right, for what is yet to be given. But, right, and I think that this is sort of the key with Catholic philosophy, or perhaps the relationship between philosophy and theology. One can only see this, right, this fertile void, and its inherent worth and dignity when one already accepts creatureliness, right, both in self and in being, and that we are given to listen and to receive, right, that the Passio Sendi is the ground of the Conatus Ascendi, can only, I think, be seen if we're already patiently listening and receiving. And that's what I think is at least partially both the gift and the task of the Catholic philosopher in particular. So that's where Professor Desmond's work has been very helpful and fruitful for my own thinking nothing. So.
Are we going in the line?
The table.
Okay. That was great, Rachel. Terrence ever told me I was supposed to prepare something.
Same, Paul.
So actually, Rachel, I'm the one who's out, and you are very much in. So, Michelle. But let me just pick up on something that you did say that was great, which is, again, this idea of the fertile void, the passio ascendi, which has been stressed today, is something I also find very fruitful in Professor Desmond's thought. And I guess what I want to say is that one of the gifts that Professor Desmond has given me specifically is thinking again, or coming to a new appreciation of different ways of practicing philosophy. Dr. Schindler mentioned the encounter with being in the between as illuminating a way of doing philosophy without having to be narrowly technical. And William has ways in his thoughts of, and sometimes often in playful ways, of being critical of a philology that masquerades as doing philosophy. And I remember there have been many moments, William knows them intimately, where I was stretching for a kind of universality that actually I got so anxious and hung up on crossing off the kind of scholarly, check boxes. And what William does in his thought is invite us to a practice of philosophy that reawakens in us a kind of wonder, it seems to me, before the mystery of being, where the mystery is not something to be conquered or overcome, but rather is an invitation to recognize the way in which the goodness of being precedes our coming to it. Dr. Schindler spoke about the joining of love and truth together in the way in which we find ourselves already and are called to be faithful to being. And against practices of philosophy that would conceive of rationality as a kind of mastering and univocal naming of the indeterminate, or a raising of equivocal problems, or even the kind of dialectical interplay of these things, William gives us in the notion of metaxology a way of being philosophical. And I guess I would put it this way, that against a kind of hermeneutics of suspicion, I've always taken William's thought to be an invitation to a kind of hermeneutics of generosity or charity. You know, the scholastics used to have this kind of maxim, right? Never deny, rarely affirm, always distinguish. And sometimes we can read this as a kind of evading the responsibility of raising criticism and instead making distinctions until they enumerate, and then you kind of get lost in the distinctions. But actually, I think a much more charitable way of reading it, and something that William has invited us to do, is to affirm all that is good in what can be said. And in the intimate universal, as he unfolds the different ways that philosophy has thought about universality, the transcendent universal and the Platonic, the more immanent universal and the Aristotelian, even in the nominalists, their effort to voice something in universality, and then the dialectic, the concrete universal, there's always a kind of criticism, but first a seeing what there is there to be seen in another thinker who offers us the gift of his reflection on being. And I found that immensely both inspirational, generous, but more than that, actually illuminative of the truth of being. So I'll stop talking. I had nothing to say, and now I have. But I will say just this, that rethinking of philosophy is a kind of fidelity to being, a kind of creative fidelity has kind of changed my entire outlook as a teacher and as a scholar, and I'm immensely grateful to William for both enacting that and giving us the language with which we could think about practicing philosophy in this way.
All right. I think in a lot of ways I want to second what both Rachel and Paul have said about Desmond's work. It's, for me, the language as a framework for thought that Desmond offers has been incredibly. For a long time, there were so many things I wanted to talk about, things I wanted to say, things I wanted to explore, and I didn't know how until I sort of encountered this language, and particularly the language of the hyperboles of being in God in the Between, that just sort of clicked, and I said, that's what I'm looking for. That's what I want to talk about. And I think that in so many ways, even when I'm not talking about Desmond's work directly, when I'm not commenting on it directly, I'm using the way that his language makes me think in order to interact with conceptual frameworks and ideas in a way that I think is just so helpful. I'm particularly interested in some of the inarticulated feelings that Augustine displays in his early work, particularly in the soliloquies, where he's sort of wrestling with what his reason is trying to tell him. And he's stuck between this desire for the universal and the desire to maintain the intimate at the same time. He can't seem to figure out how to resolve that. And it's almost like he was waiting for this language to figure out how to express what he's trying to express. He kind of finds his way through it in praxis. But when I sort of read the God in the Between, my first interaction with Desmond's work, it was this sort of conceptual aesthetics in practice made manifest. And what I've taken from that is, in addition to what he sort of says directly, the power of language, the power of the aesthetics, the power of the models through which we sort of view reality. They have power. Two models may be accurate in sort of a scientifically accurate kind of a way, or they might both express something, but they're not going to be equally useful. They're not going to be equally useful in unlocking the door to learning more and getting more. A couple weeks ago at PMR, I went to a talk where someone was referencing Desmond's language, and they got a question. I think it might have been Terrence's question, actually. Why do we need this different language? Why do we need them taxological rather than analogical? And I just sort of had this moment. I'm like, oh, I know why we need this. Because having a different word for it isn't just a synonym. It's not just a translation. It's a whole new landscape of sort of thoughts. And I likened it in my sort of immediate reaction to Richard Feynman, his understanding of different mathematical models, and how he looked at, say, Euclidean geometry and said, that's fine, but it's very fixed, it's very univocal, and it doesn't do enough to really account for what I want to do in physics. And he needed Babylonian geometry, and he says, nothing wrong with Euclidean models, it's just not going to be as useful. It doesn't give me the categories that I need to be receptive to a being that would surprise me. And I think as much as nature and physics, physical reality can surprise us, our interaction with a more subjective vision of being, our interaction with divine being can surprise us, and we should be just as open and receptive to it. The language, it's not just the de dicto that tells us about the de re. It is itself a sort of becoming, it is a being, because we are born into time, because our thinking is always going to be mediated to ourselves in many ways. We can't step out of time and still call it knowledge. We may have experience out of time, but if we're thinking about what we know, we have to be able to express it to ourselves. And how we describe reality, selfhood, knowledge, knowing, interacting, being, they depend on how we describe those things gives us what we can depend on finding and discovering in the future. If our model is too univocal, it's too closed, you already predetermine what you're going to find without realizing it. And this very open language, a language of porosity, the language of hyperbole, of overdeterminacy, is the express sort of unlocking of that and saying, be open, be receptive. And so even when I'm not talking about Desmond, I'm talking through that idea, and I'm always trying to get to that idea. Particularly in the work of Augustine, where he's sort of struggling between his conatus essendi and his passio essendi. He's struggling between wanting to know God, but also wanting to be Augustine, and his sort of fear of losing the things that might make him Augustine, but also his fear of losing the possibility of God by holding on too tightly to the things that make him Augustine. So the prosody of selfhood is something that I think is just incredibly helpful and important. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks, Michelle. I share with Paul maybe the fear that I don't have a lot to say. So if it will be permitted, I might speak somewhat autobiographically then. one. It's been written. Thank you,
Mission
Terrence. My conscience. So, yeah, I'd want to speak, I guess, about 3 different ways in which studying with William has imprinted itself upon my thinking as a young scholar of philosophy. I might flag 2 of those ways as debts, and another as a kind of inspiration. So the first debt, I think, is a sort of personal one, in that I came to graduate school to study Hegel. All 3 of these ways of being imprinted revolve around the monstrosity of Hegel. And so the first debt of personal gratitude is that there is in Hegel a character that bewitches, a sort of mode of thinking that can captivate. Right? And I was bewitched and captivated. What I have as a personal debt to William is the breaking of the spell of Hegel's thought. Don't want to exaggerate that, but there was a way in which Hegel had become a kind of unsurpassable horizon for my thinking. And that, one can imagine in many ways, is a sort of stultifying experience of stultification when the horizons become too much of a sort of, they loom too large, I suppose. William, in some sense, broke the spell of that looming bewitchment. This transitions, I think, sort of the second kind of debt, which is a conceptual one. So you break the bewitchment by sort of breaking through the conceptual barriers which Hegel erects. That conceptual indebtedness, in turn, revolves around the notion of porosity that we've discussed so far on this panel and elsewhere. This might speak somewhat to my personal attachment to Hegel. It's always been through his status as a thinker of religion. And in Hegel, the core religious thought is the thought of a finitude which passes away, and in passing away is replaced by or reveals itself to be a kind of infinitude. So he'll talk about the finite as destined to fall, and this is its contingency, destined to fall away. And the way we surpass sort of modes of finite thinking is by recognizing the finite as itself that which is destined to pass. And when it passes, we enter into the infinite. So there's a certain sense of porosity in Hegel, but it's a porosity which opens up to an infinite which then encloses around the porosity, so recuperates it to this theological infinite, Hegel's immanent God, as it were. So the conceptual debt that I owe to William is the debt of the concept of a porosity that opens without then closing again. So of a finitude, I guess, that is properly created. So a finitude that passes, but in passing away, in fact, continues to pass and pass through to an origin, which created it as a passage. I think that this is a sort of breakthrough concept for surpassing or passing through Hegel as a kind of barrier. Because there are lots of ways to, I suppose, try to assimilate or appropriate or criticize Hegel's thought, but for me it seems the way to pass through Hegel is by, in fact, passing through him. And then one has to somehow engage him on his terms. On the terms of porosity, I think he can be engaged as a thinker who both thinks and fails to think porosity. The third then point, I guess, I'd identify is that of a certain sort of inspiration, sort of philosophical method, building someone on something that Paul had said just now. So in reading William's work, it began with being in the I began with the William Desmond Reader, and then went to being in the between, ethos and ethics in the between, God in the between, intimate universal. Reading the William Desmond Reader and being in the between was struck by this thought of posthumous mind, I suppose, which hasn't been talked about today so far. But it's this thought that, in some sense, there is in the life of thought, or there can be in the life of thought, an experience of the death of thought, which, rather than itself becoming a kind of final word, a gravestone on thinking, stimulates a rebirth of thinking, which then is richer because of its having died, I suppose. This I take as a kind of inspiration only because it seems to me to have been peculiarly apt description for the experience of encountering and failing before a sort of looming thinker like Hegel, but then being reborn through that very death into a kind of renewed enthusiasm and wonder at the questions of philosophy which had been submerged somewhat by the figure who looms too greatly on the horizon. So in this sense, an inspiration owed to William, and that sort of re-inspired in me the enthusiasm for the original philosophical questions with which I began philosophy, and that had become encrusted in sort of Hegelian vocabulary. those are the things I would say.
Great. Thanks, Karl.
So I have a lot I could say, but I'm just going to keep it to one point. So for me, I'm studying theology, particularly the intersection between spirituality and systematics. And so the thing that came up in Professor Del Oro's talk today was the sort of distinction between theoretical and practical reason. And you find something like this distinction operative in kind of what counts as the boundary between systematic thought, oh, that theoretical thought over there, right? And spirituality, oh, that practical stuff that people do over there, right? And there is a sort of, I think, partition between these two, between the theoretical and the practical at times. I think the thing for me that has been very illuminating in Desmond's thought is the idea that no, actually thinking is a practice, and practice is thinking, right? These two things are not inseparable. So I would talk about porosity, not only porosity, but cultivating a mindfulness of porosity, which I think is part and parcel of what Christian spirituality is about. Michelle, I liked what you said about entering a different landscape of thought. I think Desmond gives me a sort of landscape of thought that helps me mediate kind of all of these various influences, various insights into a certain language that I don't want to say integrates, because it sort of precedes differentiation in a lot of ways, right? It sort of, in some ways, explicates or draws your attention to the place from where you stand when you are sort of beholding different phenomena, right? So you know, it would be fitting, right, as a theologian, to come to Desmond through God in the Between. That was my first introduction. Sitting in on a philosophy of religion course, and something that really struck me was in the introduction, the notion of unclogging, right? The sort of unclogging your pores, becoming porous. Like there's a certain practice that precedes or somehow is preparatory for following Desmond on this sort of journey of thought, right? In classical Christian spirituality, we might call this purgation, or a sort of via negativa. The via negativa isn't necessarily about unsaying God, but about unclogging myself, right? When you read, The Dark Knight, or when you read St. John of the Cross, as I was doing yesterday and thinking about what I was going to say today, you expect him to unsay a lot of things about God, but he really just talks about how vicious you are and about how you need to. The via negativa is a negation of myself in some ways in order to become open to and surprised by and available to the divine in some way. So that's a very short reflection, but I think that's what I would. That's been the most significant contribution to my own thinking is the idea that practice and theory and sort of discipline do not occur separately. So.
Well, thank you all very much for those reflections. William, I saw you taking some notes. Would you like? Would you like to say a few words in dialogue with these young scholars?
Just writing down the compliments.
Well, feel free to repeat.
I was writing them down because I think my wife might disagree in the sense that she might say, William, you always say nothing in so many different ways. So I think everyone here said something, even when they were saying nothing. I'm just listening like a child and jotting down some memorial thoughts. When I was a graduate student back in Penn State many years ago, I had the ambition, the way I described it then, I said I wanted to write a dissertation. I wanted to do philosophy without footnotes. And in the PhD that I submitted, I think there were about 3 or 4 footnotes, because Hegel was the only person I directly discussed, and initially there was no bibliography in it, and the university rejected it. So I had to put in a bibliography with, I put in Plato, Opera Omnia. They accepted it, but I was arrogant when I was young. But I think the impulse was correct in the sense, not, all honor to scholarship, all honor to philology. But I think from certainly my beginnings in philosophy, I wanted to try and take hold of what I took to be the things themselves. And it wasn't that I lacked debate with other thinkers, but I felt that that was, core to the very vocation of philosophy itself, to think about the things themselves. But again, thinking in this sense, not just imposing a set of categories on the things themselves, but to allow them, very phenomenological in the sense of letting things appear. Since phenomenology has been so taken over by contemporary phenomenology, I think it's in fact a very classical realist impulse, where this notion of porosity, I think, could be read back actually into ancient philosophy. Cyril was talking about Plato and Aristotle, but I find Aristotle, his epistemology, somehow the soul is everything. There's a sense of the strange enigma of the soul, not necessarily as imposing itself on everything, but certainly being open to receive the forms of all things. And that sense of ontological porosity, I think, has been altered, sometimes weakened, sometimes mutilated by the modern epistemology, which stresses construction. We know what we construct. And again, when I say that to some people, they think that this is a kind of an anti-modern rejection of human creativity, for instance. And I don't think it's that at all. So trying to balance porosity passio with conatus is an effort to acknowledge the received sources out of which our thinking and activity emerge. But if our activity is totally divorced from this more endowing source, so to say, it tends to kind of, it circles around itself. It becomes self-determining in a bad sense, but it's self-determining in amnesia of these more original porous sources. And I think the ancients, some of the ancients at least anyway, they dwelt in this porosity without necessarily making it an object of thematic reflection. In modernity, porosity and passio have been often reduced to a kind of a bad passiveness, a kind of a servile subjection to something other than oneself. And I think that certainly part of our task beyond modernity, beyond post-modernity, is to again rethink the porosity and the passio not as a kind of an abnegation of the powers of the endeavor to be, is the affirmation of being taking form in a more active or constructive way, and this is also what we are. But if its roots in already being given to be, it's endowed roots in something that is not just simply itself alone. If we can't think our way back into those sources, our pathway is again it's self-circling activity, which it tends to become hyperactivity, but it's hyperactivity that's circling around itself as a kind of void. We reproduce the porosity of being as a voiding of our own being, so to say, and have lost that openness out of which something comes into the porosity from beyond ourselves. That's again, I think, the threshold where being religious is so important, and remaining open to again, the breath of the Spirit that is breathed into us from beyond ourselves.
Yeah.
That's what I was writing here. In these
That's a very elaborate compliment. No, but I mean, in very different ways, I heard that from everyone here, right? That that the the problem of language and concepts and the systems, right, that that try to give you a fix on things, and then become themselves, the content of thought rather than being itself, and that the testimony, it seemed to me, was both to your your linguistic efforts and your modeling of the practice of philosophizing as a way of speaking, reflecting, drawing connections that allows being to penetrate our own being. Right? That doesn't. It gives us analogies. That gives us uncloggings. Right. I thought very much of the first chapter of Anselm's Proslogion, which people often skip over in philosophy classes, which is all the unclogging of Anselm.
Right.
Who is
just an addendum about footnotes. When many of my doctoral students come into me, I might tell this story, but I tell it as something that I would not recommend to them. So one of my first, and this I probably shouldn't even say this, I said, take pains to make sure that you have a good sample of significant reference to the relevant secondary material, because in that way you can keep the philological police off your back. And otherwise then do some thinking.
giving me flashbacks.
Yeah.
Does anyone up here want to say something in return, and then if there's time, open up a broader discussion?
I can respond to your response to us a little bit. Thinking about looking back and sort of seeing the lack of a discussion of, say, of a porosity doesn't necessarily mean that there wasn't an attitude of porosity in sort of ancient and late antique or early medieval mindsets. And I think that you can probably find that porosity more with the attitude towards myth and poetics in the ancient world, and the space that was held for a sort of mythopoesis and belief is sort of in direct contrast to the modern desire to sort of nail everything down in terms of this is fiction, this is fact, those are two worlds and that's it, and there's nothing between to dive into your language. And I think one of the papers that I'm most proud of that I wrote was actually on your work in God in the Between and J.R.R. Tolkien's essay on fairy stories, drawing in an illusion. And it's the only paper I have on my academia.edu page. So it's available. But it just sort of struck me, this sort of desire to get rid of wonder in so many different facets coincides directly with this desire to step outside of nature and say, I control this nature. So bringing back Deloro's talk from the morning, just sort of, okay, I am not this openness, I am not this wonder, I am a thing that controls all of this. It comes at a great cost, and I think that pretending it wasn't there in philosophy, reducing philosophy just to, here are the premises down to the conclusion, really sort of is a deliberate attempt to try to hide that from ourselves, but it can't really get rid of it.
And I'll piggyback off that as well. I think one of the things in theology that happens is sort of thematic reflections on porosity are actually usually found in much more practical, sources, right? So manuals of prayer, things like you were mentioning the first chapter of the Proslogion, right? Like there's a sort of way that porosity is an interesting concept because it demands a sort of practical enactment and a sort of familiarity that exceeds a sort of univocal theorization. And so I'm agreeing with you. It is present. It's present in a lot of places in all sorts of traditions. It's just not highlighted, I think, in a lot of theoretical discourses.
Yeah, I may then jump in my own way on this topic. See, we're thinking some about the move beyond or through modernity and postmodernity, in some sense, to a restoration of what was erased or lost or misremembered in modernity and postmodernity. We're talking about this in terms of porosity, and it seems significant to think some about some of the presentations from today, that things like porosity or like kenosis or truth, love, unity, whatever, can figure importantly or explicitly in modern and postmodern philosophy and theology, yet in the wrong ethos, right? So with the wrong affect of sorts, right? So what's significant to me is how insistent William is on the ethos of philosophy characterized by the affect of wonder. And what that means, if you take that principal or original determination of philosophy seriously, it's astounding, it's sort of astonishing how sharply that affect of wonder contrasts with the dominant governing affect of modern philosophy and postmodern philosophy. That from Descartes through Kant into Hegel and beyond, there's the dominant affect of dissatisfaction with one's ignorance and a concomitant then desire to erase the sort of blemish of one's ignorance. Right? It's a very different response to the call of being to be known than you get in the affect of wonder. Right? It's a call of being to be known that's almost like a mockery that you have to silence. And in postmodernity, the roles are just reversed. It's just being mocks us and we don't win, so we give up. Right? I think just it's significant that there's, on the one hand, the need to rethink or recover crucial concepts, but also then to rethink and recover the ethos or the soil of those concepts out of which they need to grow. It's not enough just to have kenosis. We could end up like Varimo. We would need a kenosis that is itself rooted in radical affirmation, which would be the affect of wonder, it seems.
I think that the sort of erasure of that ignorance is really sort of something that it's very fundamental in a lot of scientific discourse, at least popular scientific discourse right now. Great scientists don't have the problem. They love wonder, but sort of the lower level people who are sort of, I mean, I love Neil deGrasse Tyson. I think he's a wonderful science educator, but he sort of famously said that, stop doing philosophy. You don't, if your head's in the clouds, you'll wander into the street. And I'm like, well, that's kind of where science came from. Someone was bothering to look outside of the current paradigm. I just think it's a popular thing. Lots of other popular scientists are like, don't do philosophy. It's silly. Don't think about religion. Don't be open. Don't be wonder. Just accept what I say. And it's just this sort of dogmatism and scientism that I think is very anti-science and anti the project of science, but it's very popular right now. It's pretend we were never confused about this. Pretend we can't still be confused about this, because if you acknowledge it, you might realize it's true.
Yeah. So sort of forgetting of who we are as questioners and why we questioned in the first place.
Yeah.
As pathological focus on the questioning and the solution to the questions, then we lose the sort of original question of our meaning as questioners.
It's something that I think from God in the Between, it's something childish that you're supposed to outgrow.
Maybe closing remarks from the left, right side of the table.
It's gonna haunt me now.
Well, then I have this sad task. My Eros Tyrannos is sometimes sad. I would love to keep hearing what you guys have to say. It's a distinct honor to be able to work with you in all these different settings. But time takes no vacation, as Augustine said. So we have about a 10-minute break. So restrooms, coffee, return, and then the man himself will further along. Awesome. Thank you all.